Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Hello, everyone, and thank you for attending today's webinar. This webinar will be broadcast over voice over IP as well as the teleconference. The webinar is being recorded, and it will be available on the TIDCO website later this week. You'll also receive a follow-up email that will contain a link to the recording. This presentation is going to be a bit different than most. We're going to ask you to ask lots of questions of our esteemed panel throughout the session, so please take advantage of that. And with that, let me introduce our speakers. The dazzling gentleman up left is Howard Dresner. He's one of the foremost thought leaders in business intelligence and performance management. He coined the term business intelligence. He is now executive founder of Dresner Advisory Services, and he's been in the business for quite some time. The dapper gentleman in the middle is Shawn Rogers. He's in charge of analytics strategy for TIDCO. Shawn is an internationally recognized thought leader, speaker, and author, and he talks all over the world on big data, analytics, and cloud. And the creepily airbrushed individual on the right is moi, myself, David Sweenor, and I have been in the business for 20 years, hands-on experience doing analytics and data warehousing. So with that, here's the agenda we'll cover today. We're going to talk about analytic trends and the state of the business based on Howard's great research. We're going to talk about analytics within the organizations, users, techniques, AI, and IoT, and advancing curriculum. And we will pause after each of these sections and address any questions that the audience may have or in the Q&A session. And with that, I'm going to pass the ball to Howard to begin the presentation. Take it away, Howard.
Great. Thanks, David. I appreciate that introduction, and welcome, everybody. Thanks for joining us. So we're going to go over a number of topics today, starting off with just some overview of the marketplace, and just to give you some sense of what we do at Dresner Advisory Services. We just celebrated our 10th anniversary, and we focus on independent, objective research for the industry, all primary research. So we publish roughly 14 major reports per year, and for today's session, we're drawing on a number of those reports, including our Advanced and Predictive Analytics report. But I want to start off by giving just some background regarding the marketplace so that you have some perspective. So we'll start off with our first chart here, maybe. Bear with me just a moment. There we go. Okay, so first of all, I'd like to start off by saying that most organizations perceive themselves to be successful with business intelligence. And I should say, when I talk about business intelligence, it really is an umbrella term. It's all about end-user access to and analysis of data or information. So it's inclusive of a lot of things. The pieces and the parts underneath it certainly change over time, as we expand into advanced and predictive analytics and machine learning and a whole host of other things. That's why it's a useful umbrella term. But you can see that the greatest number of folks here believe that they're at least somewhat successful with business intelligence, which is great. Of course, we would like to see that 33% in that blue shaded area increase quite a bit over time, and arguably it will. I think that as more folks come into the market, it takes a few years for them to get things under their belt and start to experience what they perceive to be success. So if we go to the next slide, we can see, talking about penetration, we've been tracking penetration for a number of years, but I just took a look at 2015 versus 2017. And years ago, I introduced a term, I hope I introduced it for the first time, called information democracy back in 1993, which is the whole notion that everybody in the organization needs timely and actionable insight to do their job. And so what we see here, and perhaps things aren't progressing as quickly as we'd like, is that penetration is definitely improving. So you can see that under 10% bar, that's the number of people within organizations within our community that respond to our surveys that say users have access to things like business intelligence. And so it's been shifting slowly, gradually, towards higher levels of penetration. So starting to achieve that notion of what we call information democracy, which is a good thing. More eyes on the data is definitely a good thing and advantageous for organizations. And then we also ask our respondents about what they plan to do over the course of the next few years with things like business intelligence and analytics, and you can see that they're pretty ambitious. They're bullish about where they're going. You can see that the under 10% dominates in that top set of bars. That's, more than about 35% have relatively low penetration, but you can see when you look at 12 months, it drops rather substantially. That under 10% drops down to just over 20% of the population, and that's good. And the deeper penetration bar, that green bar, is increasing. So that's good. And what's important about 12 months is typically there are projects and maybe even budget that's been allocated and earmarked for those things. So you can sort of hang your hat on 12 months. 24 months and 36 months, that's speculative or aspirational in nature, so we probably won't get there. But the point is that there is real ambition to improve access to insight within organizations. So we're feeling pretty good about that. We'd like it to go faster, but this is good news. In terms of objectives, we always ask them what they're planning to do with all of that insight, and we throw one in there that's sort of an easy one: better decision making. All right, that's not really measurable, but of course everybody wants to make better decisions. I suppose if we put making worse decisions in there, nobody would select that, hopefully. But the other ones are a little bit more measurable. So things like improved operational efficiency, that's the number 2 answer. And right behind that is growth in revenues. So there's more of a bend towards operational efficiency and more introspective types of applications, followed by sort of the more externally focused applications, as you would expect certainly for larger organizations. If we were to break this out by small organizations, you would see more of a propensity towards externally focused applications. So growth in revenues, increased competitive advantage. When you look at the larger organizations, there's more of a focus on improved operational efficiency and things like enhanced customer service. Next, let's take a look at who's actually driving this notion of business intelligence and, by extension, analytics within the organization. And this has actually changed, which is sort of interesting as it relates to things like advanced and predictive. Operations has become much more of a driver within organizations than they have been in previous years. For years, and we've been conducting these studies going on 9 years now. For years, it was executive management followed by finance, and then it flowed from there. But operations certainly was a surprise to us that for the last 2 years, they've moved into first place in terms of driving it. And that operational flavor means that you end up with very different applications, and arguably it moves downstream into the organization because there are more people that are involved in running the operation and therefore need relevant insights to do so. So it's definitely been a sea change. And I think that the next chart also supports that. When you see what's been going on, who the targeted users are for business intelligence and, once again, by extension, analytics. So executives are still the top consumers or the top targets of these insights for running the business, but you can see it's been flowing downward, and we've been following this over the course of many years now, and it's been shifting downwards from executives and middle managers all the way down to individual contributors and professionals, and increasingly towards customers and, to some degree, even suppliers. And once again, going back to that whole notion of information democracy, we want to get those insights out there. We want to get them out there not only to internal users, but to other stakeholders as well, especially when you look at customers and suppliers. It's a great way of showing your customers that you're aligned with their priorities, and it's also a great way of ensuring that your suppliers are aligned with your strategy as well. So this is actually a positive indicator to my way of thinking. And the last chart for this section that I want to share with you has to do with the actual information that we're sharing out there. And trying to get to, there we go. When we look at the state of data, this is actually an improving and an encouraging picture. So data, of course, I mean, that's the raw material, and our data has to be in as good a shape as is conceivably possible, because otherwise we're just making bad decisions faster. So this notion, and this actually comes from my second book, Profiles and Performance, being able to evaluate how people feel about their data and the state of data, and it really speaks to governance and things of that sort as well. And so the bars on the far left, that's where users feel like they can really rely on the data, that it's data as truth, it's the gospel. They don't have to argue about the veracity of that data anymore, which wastes an awful lot of time in most organizations. The next bar to the right of that still speaks to a common view of data, but perhaps people have different views on top of that, or different perspectives on top of that. And then it flows downhill from there, and where you get to all the way on the right, where there are very inconsistent data sources. People really just don't trust their data. So the point is, over the last 3 years, this has actually been steadily improving. Organizations, now granted, organizations that believe data is truth is still in the minority. It's roughly around 27, 28%, but it's still improving, and so it's an upward trend, and we're encouraged by that. And those other bars, the more negative bars, tend to be in a somewhat of a decline. So we'll see how we end up doing next year, of course, when we run this survey again. Hopefully that the trust associated with data and the governance associated with data will continue to improve and be on that upward swing. So on that note, I'm going to pause, and we're going to take some questions.
Yes. So please answer your questions in the Q&A box.
David, this is Shawn. I'm not able to hear you. It sounds like your line might have cut out.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah, can hear you better now. Thanks.
Okay. All right. So sorry about that. So the first question, audience, please enter your questions in the Q&A box, and we will answer them as they are received. So I like this notion, Howard, of timely and actionable insights and the shift from operations, and we see executives in that going down to different levels of the organizations. So my first question is for Shawn. What do you think the kind of the keys to success or barriers organizations are seeing for analytics?
I think you just directed that one at me. Yep. I found the number very interesting, Howard, that operations overtook the executive suite here, and that's a significant shift. And I think that from where I sit, if I look at our customers and hear what they have to say, it doesn't surprise me that it's starting to move into other areas. And I think a lot of that has to do with the success and also probably pressure from executives to drive their businesses with that type of insight. So if you're going to meetings every day and the executive level individual has their hands on dashboards, has their hands on insights, you want to probably be able to mirror that as well. Do you think that that's part of what's driving operations people to jump ahead a little bit?
Yes, I think certainly that's true. I don't know if you remember, us old-timers remember things like executive information systems, and which were nothing more than, pretty slideshows for executives. But back then, for those executives, they were the only ones that had that information. And so they used it to bully everybody else or to second-guess everybody else. And those days have changed. I think that with the generational change of CEOs that are more forward-thinking, that understand the value of data, not only do they want to have access to those insights to run their business, they want everybody below them to have it as well. So it's been pushed down. But you're right, if you have an executive or the C-levels that are managing their business based on these insights, everybody underneath them will feel that pressure to have that information as well, so that when they walk into those executive management meetings, everybody's aligned. Because we've seen the reverse of that, where you get into one of the executive meetings and everyone's got different numbers. So finance has got, you ask them, how were sales? And finance has one definition of sales, and the sales organization has a different definition of sales. And you end up arguing around, once again, who's got the right set of numbers. So there's certainly that. But I think that also there's a tremendous amount of competitive pressure and price and cost pressure on organizations right now, as new players come into the marketplace. So they really need to know their numbers. They really need to know what's driving their business. They can't rely just on quote unquote experience or intuition anymore. They need to have hard facts so they can operate as effectively and efficiently as is conceivably possible.
Yeah, I agree. It actually segues quite well into the other big point that you made, which is the state of the data. And we've got a couple of questions in there. One of the first ones comes from Craig P. And he says, do you find a difference in the priority for organizations regarding what they're pursuing, whether it's BI services or data quality, one before the other, or do these initiatives tend to progress together? Does your research paint a picture that we're progressing on the data front while we're progressing on the adoption front of BI, or are they tragically out of sync? I think it's a great, Craig, thanks for the question. It's a good one.
It is a good question, and the answer is it depends on the organization. And you also, within organizations, you have different functions that have different priorities. IT certainly hasn't gone away. IT is much more focused on the data, I would argue, and then of course you've had roles, and we'll talk about this in a second, chief data officers that have emerged, that is their primary focus on the data. I mean, not just governance of the data, but making sure that the data is consistent and reliable and is treated as an asset within the organization. And then you have the users on the other side that just, they're in the desert looking for a drink of water. So anything, please give us anything. So I think it's a difficult balance. You do have to do both. Which comes first, the cart or the horse? My personal opinion is you got to do them both simultaneously, and that's like rebuilding the aircraft in flight. And it's hard to do because you got to run the business, but at the same time you've got to ensure the quality associated with and the completeness associated with the data. So it's a difficult dance. I've seen it done. I've done case studies like that where it can be done, where initially you give the users some data, that you try to be expeditious about it, realizing that perhaps the data associated with that particular application may not be perfect. All right, there may be issues, errors within the data, and over time, incrementally, you increase the number of sources of data, and you also improve the quality of that data. And what's your opinion, Shawn? What have you seen?
Well, I'll go back to how you began the answer, which is it certainly does. It's dictated by the company, the size of the company, and so on. I think smaller companies tend to be more agile, and I think larger companies really require some maybe perhaps innovative or smart technology to help them solve some of those data problems, because it is becoming more important. So if you're going to lean directly on business insight and analytics in general, you can't have that debate about is this the right data or is this data trustworthy, and you use that word in your slide. I think having trust in the data is important, so I think it makes it, there's a bigger demand for agility and flexibility around the data and certain levels of governance. And I think, most smart large companies are looking for a way to bring their data together in a central sort of way so that everybody's sort of dipping their bucket into the same well. And I think that that's part of the solution is making sure that you have a curated sort of layer within the organization to go and tap into for these insights. And if everybody's going to that same layer, I think it eliminates a lot of the trouble.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that you've seen things, things tend to go to extremes, and then you strike a balance at some point. And, we went through this era or this period of time where the users took control, and all of a sudden we had a myriad of conflicting data sources out there, and I think things are starting to come back in the other direction towards greater governance, but still respecting the user's needs for those critical insights.
Yeah, for certain. So we've got other questions on the data stuff, Howard, and I'm going to hold them, and David can give them to us here at the end. But why don't you move forward into your next section and keep the questions coming, folks. They're great, and we'll try to get to as many of them when we're finished. We've got time set aside for that.
Sure. All right. So I'll jump into a couple of quick slides just that speaks to organization. And I've actually written about organizing for success with business intelligence for a long time in the context of our Business Intelligence Competency Center report. And even before that, I think I've been talking about the notion of centers of excellence and competency center and organizing for success since about 2001, if I recall correctly. But recently, in the last few years, we've seen the emergence of a couple of new roles, and I think it's actually a positive thing. There aren't enough of them out there. It's still relatively early days, but the notion of the Chief Data Officer and the Chief Analytics Officer within organizations. And what's important about this is very often they're doing the work that we had defined as part of the Competency Center or Center of Excellence, but they have far more scope. They've been elevated in the organization, so they have greater authority and greater visibility. And so I think it's actually a very encouraging sign. And here we just took a look at, we built a crosstab, taking a look at organizations that have a Chief Data Officer and or a Chief Analytics Officer and how successful they are over time. And so it takes a moment to get your head around the chart, but what it shows here is that once you've established one of these roles, either the Chief Data Officer or the Chief Analytics Officer, their success rate with the notion of business intelligence and analytics actually improves over time. If you go all the way to the right, you can see that it's much more mixed if they don't have one of these roles. I mean, they might have a measure of success, but this chart suggests that if you have a Chief Data Officer and or a Chief Analytics Officer, hopefully both of them, you stand a far better chance of being successful with these initiatives over time. The other message is, once you've established one or both of these roles, they're not an overnight success. You've just got to be patient, and you can see that things start to improve in subsequent years. And so you just got to stick with it. And that's sort of advice I give for lots of different projects and initiatives and organizational changes. You know, it just, things don't change dramatically in 6 months. It's typically a multi-year type of initiative. So this has been encouraging. Obviously, we'll be studying this again in the future and even asking more questions. Those of you that do participate in our surveys, just, you know, you'll see more and deeper questions regarding these roles and how they're actually being valued within the respective organizations. And then just a quick slide talking about budget plans, and this is also encouraging. There's, you know, there are other crosstabs that are actually in our Wisdom of Crowds business intelligence market study where we look at the multiple dimensions. But what's notable here is that when we look at budget plans across our entire community, for the most part, they're going up. So budgets are increasing, and, you know, for 45%, they're basically staying the same. Only 5% are decreasing these things over time. So here's the really interesting thing, which is not in this slide, which is it turns out, and this is a little bit counterintuitive, right, but it turns out that the organizations that are most successful with business intelligence are increasing their spending year over year. And the ones that are less successful are generally decreasing or holding their spending, and it actually should be the reverse in many ways, or maybe everybody should be spending more. But it says to me that if you're not succeeding and you know you need to succeed with delivering insight to users, you need to ramp that up, which means you need to fund it, you need to staff it, because the alternative is, well, is not going to be good, right? The alternative is ultimately your demise as an organization because your competitors will best you and will have better information and will achieve better alignment with the goals and the strategy of the organization. So the good news is that overall, budgets are improving. Investments are growing as it relates to things like business intelligence and analytics. So, more questions?
Great, thanks. So, Howard, there are a couple of questions that they're slightly related. And, you know, one was from, so it'll be, you know, switching industries, you know, from oil and gas, from automotive, and, you know, suggested that, you know, that data is not really bad data in oil and gas. So how can they, you know, overcome and fix that? And, you know, maybe do you think a CAO, CDO is the answer to some of that, or?
Well, the answer is it could be. I mean, I think that it all comes down to charter, right? What's the charter associated with a CDO role? Are they just an influencer? Where do they report into in the organization? Did they come from the organization? Did they, politics definitely play into this as well. So I think that if you have a CDO that has the appropriate charter and the authority and the organization, the staffing, the budget, then, and the right person, of course, yeah, they can start to make great strides. And once again, I've seen organizations do that successfully, and I've seen organizations stumble. Once again, same thing with centers of excellence. If they don't have the proper charter and organization and funding, then there's very little that they can do, even if they know what needs to be done. And sometimes it gets mired in politics because they're just influencers in that particular scenario and don't have much control.
Okay. So, Shawn, I know you've done a little bit of work on this, kind of where does, sort of work component to this, to where these, these CAO, CDO people sit, physically, or how do they report, or any thoughts on that?
Yeah, most certainly. And it's an interesting thing. When the BI and discovery and visualization stuff started to really become important to businesses, you're often asked, how do we do this right? And one of the answers, or part of the answer, was always, well, make sure you have a significant stakeholder within the organization to back this initiative. If you don't have a significant C-level or executive level stakeholder in the project, you're going to have a hard time getting these projects to move. And I think the biggest difference between the stakeholder answer and the CAO or CDO answer is that we're no longer having a debate about should we do these projects. Now the debate is, how should we do them? Should they be centered in should they be part of a center of excellence? And is the optimal stakeholder a CDO or a CAO? And I think that also speaks to the maturity that Howard's talking about today around why different parts of the organization are becoming involved and so on. So just having a stakeholder really isn't as important anymore, because we're not debating whether or not this is a good idea. We're now debating, hey, I've got 40 projects. Which are the first 3 that should be in the queue? And what systems should they leverage, and how can we make all of these projects move faster and get to critical mass or return on investment quicker? So, I think that whether or not you're a CDO or a CAO, I think that job title has a C in it, and I think that the only way it works is for them to be fit into the organization at a C level. And in some circumstances, I see them answering into the chief executive officer of businesses, or certainly the CIO tends to also have that capacity within their organization. But I think it's important that they're not too far or departed from the very top ranks within the company, because if the company is really truly treating their data and their analytics as a true asset and competitive differentiator, you have to have the clout from the top. And I don't know, Howard, do you think that they fit better or worse in certain areas within the org? And what's your thought on the stakeholder versus CDO, CAO thing? Have we kind of replaced one with the other?
Well, a couple of interesting things. We found that for the most part, when the CDO role did not report into the CEO, they reported into the CIO. So there was a greater affinity with IT. The CAO role, if they did not report into the CEO, tended to report into finance from our study. So, but I think it does come down to the culture of the organization and where they ought to report into. Sometimes IT is well aligned with the business, and that could be a good place. But I think that notion of elevating this to the strategic level in the organization is spot on. And we didn't have that 10 years ago. Now, a lot of the stuff was an afterthought, and it's no longer an afterthought. People realize that this is job one. They've got to do this. And by nominating and by creating these roles and by having them report into the C-levels, it does give them that additional credibility within the organization to focus on not just on the data, but on how we're consuming the data and leveraging it within the business. So from my perspective, I think that's very encouraging. Even though it's still early days, we wish more organizations were making this level of investment.
Hey, Howard, a quick clarification, and we're going to move on to the next section because I've got a lot of great content to come about. In the survey of CDOs and CAOs, there was a question of what percentage of respondents answered don't have one.
About 85%. So it's thank you for that clarification. It's still really early days. It's growing. And so we'll have 3 years of the data, starting next year when we collect data again for the CDO and CAO roles. And so we certainly hope that that trend will continue and perhaps escalate.
Okay, great. Well, I appreciate that, Howard. So let's move on. And audience, please continue to ask questions. These are great questions, and it makes for a better webinar. So thanks. Keep them coming.
Sure. Okay, so I have one slide talking about technology. So we survey our respondents about a whole host of technologies. I believe there are 35 of them here. We grow it every year. So at some point, it's not going to fit on the slide anymore. But we ask them about all these different related technologies and initiatives. And you can see, not surprisingly, at the top, things like reporting and dashboards and Viz and self-service and data warehousing are at the top of the list. It's kind of like the meat and potatoes, and they seem to stay there. They jockey around a little bit. But you can also see things like data mining and advanced algorithms, predictive, things like machine learning fit in there as well. That's been in the top handful, certainly in the top 10, for as long as we've been tracking this. And so it remains a very high priority for organizations. There are other things on here, too, that are growing in nature. Things like big data has certainly been growing, and other things have, been settling. So open source that seemed to be picking up, it's settling down again a little bit. But for the most part, we're going to talk a bit about things like these advanced predictive things, as well as artificial intelligence and things like machine learning and data science in subsequent charts. So I'm going to pause again just to see if there are any questions about that particular chart that I just shared.
Sure. And audience, please keep them coming. So, it was interesting to me, Howard, and, your first set of components of your survey, they're about visualizing, and really, to me, it was telling the story of the data. And so we'll probably get to it, but, are those stories, more reactive, or are we seeing more of a shift towards trending towards using prediction, or any insights there?
I think there are a number of things to think about. So you're right, there's been a lot of rear view mirror analysis, what happened. And organizations for a while now have been trying to focus more so on what might happen to predict and to prepare for what outcomes might be, but also to access and analyze the data more intelligently. In other words, direct the user to where they ought to be, which is, especially helpful because sometimes meaning gets lost in the myriad of data that's out there. So it's a whole host of things that are going on simultaneously to actually make the users smarter in their use of the underlying data, and as a result of that, allowing them to take action more quickly than they otherwise would have been able to.
Okay, great. And Shawn, I saw a lot of things on that chart that, sometimes I think the definitions are nebulous to people. So like AI or cognitive or perhaps even cloud and big data. So, do you have any recommendations or thoughts on, kind of where to start or how to, separate, hype from reality, I guess?
Well, I wish I was in charge of separating hype from reality, but I'm not. But, the interesting thing about Howard's chart that he started off with is this thing continues to grow. Every time I build this chart, every year we do the research, it gets longer, and at some point it'll be hard to fit everything on the chart. And I think what it says to me, and I'm looking, obviously I have access to Howard's research, and I've looked at this chart before. What it says to me is that one size doesn't fit all anymore. And while there are certain workloads or use cases, like Howard mentioned, like reporting and dashboarding, that are very common and that many, many people that take Howard surveys find important, at the same time, there's this much broader net being cast. And that net includes things like data mining and machine learning and AI. It also includes streaming and so on. And I think for me right now, I think that the industry is maturing to where this one-size-fits-all doesn't work. I think that, from a solution standpoint, you need to help customers with, more of a comprehensive suite, and I'm not saying a monolithic stack. What I'm saying is that everybody's analytic needs are going to be different. The size of the company dictates that. The type of company or industry that they're in will dictate that. And whether or not they're chasing some of these really cool things like artificial intelligence and machine learning, like predictive analytics, like IoT or edge computing or streaming, all of these things, you know, gosh, we weren't talking about a lot of this stuff a handful of years ago, or if we were, it was in a very future sort of way. Now it's almost table stakes. And so you have to, I think, come into the market and offer people the ability to embed their analytics into, you know, proprietary applications. You need to be able to help them with streaming data if that's one of their challenges. You need to be able to address the top of that chart with reporting and dashboards and viz and all of that. And you also need to, as Howard mentioned in the top 10, you need to come to the table with some ability around advanced analytics and machine learning, because the data is too big, too deep for us to do it manually anymore. So machine learning is just simply that idea of not trying to teach the computer everything or the software everything it needs to know. You allow the software to have the smartness to look at data and learn as it goes. And that's really the subtle difference, but it's a huge strategic change. And I think it's only going to grow, and I think the demand for it's going to become even larger. So, yeah, the hype part's fun, David, but I think that there's plenty of real use cases out there for this technology as well, and I think Howard's research supports that.
And let me just pile on there. You just put out a number of really important concepts there, and I agree with that. But I would say that hype is unfortunate and it's unavoidable, and people try to generalize things as a result, and you can't. It's horses for courses, and when people start talking about some of the, you know, whatever the newfangled thing is, I say, well, what's the use case? It has to come down to the use case. What are you hoping to achieve? And to your point, you're talking about things like streaming data or machine learning. There are use cases for that. And the other thing that's worth noting is these things are all related to one degree or another. So if you're using advanced algorithms and things like machine learning, if you're accessing, you know, big data and trying to distill that down to some real meaning, that feeds other forms of business intelligence and other paradigms. So that may flow into your dashboards. So they're not necessarily mutually exclusive, but once again, it comes down to having an understanding of what the capabilities of the various technologies are.
Okay, well, that's a great point. Yep, that's a great point. So, Howard, in the interest of time, we have lots of questions coming in. Audience, please keep asking them, but I think we should move on to the next section.
Yeah, indeed. Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about IoT and artificial intelligence. And IoT is huge. We just released our third annual Iot Intelligence Report just earlier this week, actually. And IoT is one of those things, yes, it certainly, there's a hype engine associated with it, but it's real. The data is being collected. The sensors are doing their job. The data is ending up in somebody's cloud somewhere, you know, maybe your company's cloud or your on-prem in your organization. But it is real, and it's being leveraged, and it's still early days, but it's going to have a significant impact. And you can see, just looking at this chart here, the changes from 2016 to 2017 are subtle, and we'll see what happens, of course, next year. So it's early days in terms of just general awareness of IoT or Internet of Things, but it is shifting towards more important than it was in the previous year. And so I think organizations need to know what their answer is going to be or what approach they're going to take when it comes to things like IoT. The next chart, we just talk and look at organizations that feel IoT is important by their success with business intelligence. Okay, and the question is, you know, which came first, chicken or the egg, right? So it's important to note that those that have been very successful with business intelligence also think that IoT is important, and maybe that just speaks to their general maturity in leveraging data and providing insights to their users, and this is sort of the next horizon for them because they're mature enough they can take advantage of it. I'm not sure. I'm guessing that's probably the case as opposed to them being successful because they think IoT is important. That's probably not the case. But the point is, it is coming to fruition. Successful organizations are starting to leverage it and take advantage of it. And as part of that, they will be taking advantage of things like advanced and predictive analytics with IoT simply because separating the signal from the noise when you're dealing with things like IoT, gets really complex. And it also introduces things like edge computing, which we're not going to tackle today. But you have to use advanced techniques if you're going to try and make sense of the myriad of data that's going to be presented as part of IoT. And so when you look at what we call, the advocates for IoT today, you can see that they are subscribers. They use advanced and predictive analytics, or they're evaluating it if they're not currently using it. But there's definitely a difference between those people that are investing or are looking very hard at IoT and those that are using advanced and predictive analytics today. And the next chart really speaks to the importance of artificial intelligence and business intelligence too. And you can see that increasingly things like artificial intelligence is growing in importance. I mean, it's actually a pretty significant shift just in 1 year's difference. And once again, this goes hand in glove with things like big data and IoT in order to make sense of vast volumes of diverse data. It's important to have a little help, and things like artificial intelligence, using things like machine learning, can definitely add to the mix and give you another tool, so to speak, that you can use to take advantage of that data and once again try to distill it down to something that is understandable by human beings. So on that note, I'm going to pause again, and we'll take some of your questions.
Great. So there's a comment in there, someone who's interested from a use case in detecting machine learning. So I'm thinking these machines are all over the places, and maybe this is a question for Shawn, but, is there a different way, when you use, we're moving into more of these advanced techniques, is there a different way organizations need to think about doing analytics? Can I still bring this back to a server and crunch it on my laptop, or is there just other alternatives out there to that approach?
Yeah, I think it's becoming very important that, anybody that wants to do analytics, especially IoT-driven analytics, you kind of need to stand up and look at sort of this ecosystem that you're dealing with. So much of the data, as Howard mentioned, that's out at the edge piles up rather quickly. I just saw this great use case this last week in San Diego. TIBCO hosted its TIBCO Now event and had about 800 customers at the program. And we showed some technology that did exactly what Howard was just talking about, and it showed exactly why you have to have some agility in your analytics. Moving all of the data from the edge all the way back to whatever your core is, wherever your data center is or wherever you traditionally do analytics, is really becoming somewhat of an arcane approach to IoT analytics, especially high-velocity IoT analytics. And the example that I saw last week was sensors that were kind of emitting or delivering 2,000 sort of raw pieces of data every couple of seconds. And of course, the data was piling up rather quick. And the dashboard I was watching showed that, at one point there was something like 25 million pieces of raw data had accumulated. And by putting an analytic model on a gateway or a device at the edge and being able to manage it centrally is exactly what most companies will be doing. And I saw a great question from Nanda M in the queue here, and she asked, Nanda asked about detecting machine failure. And this is a great example of how companies are using IoT and advanced analytics to predict things. And this example that I saw with these, 20, 25 million sort of raw pieces of information, by putting the correct model at the edge with the data, so moving the analytics to the data, allowed the system to distill all of that data down to 1,000 predictions. And those 1,000 predictions were then moved back for systems and or people to be able to make decisions off of, but they were predictive. And that's exactly, Nanda, to your question, that's exactly how companies are doing things like predictive machine failure and those types of use cases. So, I think the new normal is to be able to have the flexibility to move your analytics to the data, not always to move your data to the analytics. I think it addresses issues of security and speed to insight. And I think especially in the IoT realm, it's going to be a requirement going forward. If you can't do that, I think you're going to have a hard time doing this form of analytics. And I don't know, Howard, do you agree, disagree? Is it going to be table stakes at some point?
I have to agree with you. I think well, when you look at the volumes of data, you can't move it anymore. You can't move a petabyte of data, not reasonably anyway. And also, when you look at edge computing, you need those edge devices to be able to send essence, if you will, the real indicators. And that also elevates another technology that was pretty early. It was too early, actually. Complex event processing all of a sudden becomes important again. We were talking about, when I was at Gartner, we were talking about business activity monitoring back in, gosh, when was that? I don't know, 20 years ago? But it was too early. It was right, but it was too early because you didn't have the volume and the velocity of data like you do today. So it does become table stakes because I think that things are just moving so much more quickly and they're accelerating. So organizations are going to have to address these things, and they're going to have a roadmap and a plan for doing it.
Well, Howard, I think that's a great segue into the next section. When people are evaluating, advanced and predictive, what are the key capabilities people are looking at these days?
Yeah, it's a good point, and it's going to change over time. So if we just take a look at importance, now things have been fairly stable. So I showed you that one chart with the 35 different technologies and initiatives, and you could see that advanced and predictive analytics was way at the top, and it's been cemented there in terms of its importance or criticality within organizations. So it's been relatively static. I think this is changing and will change when we publish our next advanced and predictive report next year. I think we're going to see an uptick because all these things are related. And in fact, just very quickly, when you look at things like IoT and Iot Intelligence, as we call it, there are several technologies that are absolutely critical in order to harness that IoT data and make sense of it and leverage it for the business. Big data is certainly part of that. Advanced and predictive is really part of that. Also things like location intelligence and others. So this is front and center. Things like IoT and big data are driving the importance of advanced and predictive analytics. When you look at current deployment, boy, is there a huge opportunity here. All right, because that gray shaded area, 23%, that's who within our community say that they're using advanced and predictive analytics today. When you look at those that are evaluating, that's another 16%, so arguably they'll be using it within the next 12 months, and then we may use it in the future. Gosh, that could be out 3+ years, and then 26% are doing nothing. So I think that this is going to change, and it sort of reminds me very quickly about cloud computing. When you look at public cloud, we've been tracking that for 7 years, and 7 years ago, the majority of organizations said, hell no, we won't go. Well, through education and through just need and demand, and because of the economics, that changed over time, so that number has gotten smaller every year. That's definitely going to be the case with advanced and predictive too. This is going to shift as people feel that need, and also as they become educated and staff up accordingly. When we look at features for advanced and predictive, not surprisingly, you find that the most popular features are the more common ones, and neural nets are down there. In other words, machine learning is down towards the bottom. That's certainly going to grow over time, but people are looking to do things like regression and things like clustering and decision trees, which is not machine learning. And I have to just share a very quick anecdote. I was at a conference. I won't say which one or where it was, but the speaker was referring to things like decision trees as machine learning. I'm like, hold on, that would be statistics, right? I think that people, once again, the hype engine gets cranking, and people just throw out that term machine learning to mean statistics. And you have to be on your guard, and you have to be educated so that you know enough to be able to discern which is which. There is so much in that statistics box, if you will, that can be leveraged and utilized by a data scientist or an analyst before you even get to machine learning. Once again, it comes down to things like use cases. You got to know what the use case is, and you have to educate yourself if you haven't already. When you look at usability associated with advanced and predictive analytics, it does still tend to favor the data scientist. And back in the 90s, some of you may remember, some of the vendors were pushing data mining on every desktop. Well, that's silly, right? Because it just doesn't make any sense. Even if if every user could make use of data mining, it wouldn't be actionable. So it still does favor as I think it should, the data scientist, the expert that understands how to leverage the various techniques and approaches in sort of ensemble fashion to achieve the best result for the business. So things like easy iteration is important, and things like simple process for continuous modifications of models. And you go all the way down to the bottom, and the user saying, well, at the bottom, a specialist not required to create analytical models. That's the least important to them. So that may change over time, certainly, as these things get more approachable. But for the most part, I would say that it's appropriate that you have an expert, somebody that has trained in using these advanced techniques to be driving them to support other people with them further downstream. Scalability is obviously going to increase over time. It's really important, the various techniques. You can see in database analytics, for instance, to the point that Shawn made just a moment ago, that you want to move the analysis to where the data is, and so that, especially for more complex sort of techniques, as opposed to trying to move the data all around the organization or to a particular on-prem server or application. And then we take a look at the industry as well and ask them what they're doing, just to kind of make sure that they're aligned. So a few charts on that. When you look at industry support for the variety of analytical features, once again, it's that 80-20 rule again, right? So the 20% of functionality that 80% need tend to be well supported. And when you get down to the right, things like ensemble learning and vector machine support, you tend to find less support. But for the most part, you see pretty good support for those top or most important user features. So there's general alignment between the industry and for the users. Now, here's where we see a little bit of a difference in terms of, at least, and once again, this is at the aggregate level. So there's general alignment here, but the one that stands out that's different between the industry support for usability and the users is that third bar from the left, that a specialist is not required. So it suggests that the industry is spending a lot of time trying to find ways to make their technology more usable, and that's laudable, certainly. But I still do think that that ease of use, improved usability, probably ought to focus more so on the data scientist and the analyst, as opposed to your garden variety end user. And then in terms of scalability, good alignment here. So it says that the industry is focused on the right things, almost exactly what the users had suggested that they're looking for in the industry. So that's encouraging. Once again, in-memory analytics, certainly for the individual analyst in particular, and then moving the analytics to where the data actually resides. And then I just have one more chart that I want to share. So we always rate the vendors. These are independent ratings for every one of the reports that we do produce. And so this is for advanced and predictive analytics, which we released over the summer. And so just to give you some orientation here, so we take a look at the analytical features and functions, their data preparation capability, usability, scalability, and then, of course, the overall score. You can see that our hosts today are actually #1 position, so congratulations to them. And so now I'll turn it back over to David for additional questions.
All right. Well, thank you for that, Howard, and we're proud to be featured and highlighted in your research. That's great. We have about 7 minutes left, so I think maybe we have time for a question here. But I'm going to address this one first to Shawn. As I looked at some of the algorithms there, like regression and things like that, some of these things were developed back in 1950. And Howard, he said on more than one occasion, it really, you got to understand what the use case is. But I guess my fundamental question is are algorithms becoming commoditized, and is it more important to figure out how to put this into business process or something of that nature? Because there's a lot of algorithms, there's a lot of problems, but is there something more important than the math that organizations maybe aren't considering or should be considering more?
Well, I'll start and say that, my opinion, commoditization of the algorithms is an interesting way to look at it. It's, the math has been around for a long time, and as companies are starting to mature in their approach around analytics or advanced analytics or algorithmically driven insights, I think what happens is, and I think we saw this happen in the BI space traditionally as well, that it becomes even more important not just to have the math and the algorithms, which I think you have to have the large variety of that, and we do in our products. I think what becomes more important is can you manage the life cycle of the model that you're deploying into your environment? Can you manage models that are out at the edge? Do you have the proper enterprise level governance and security and performance management around what you're doing in advanced analytics? And I think that that's becoming even more important for our customers. You know, many of them a handful of years ago started to dabble in advanced analytics, and Howard's research shows that that's starting to, you know, become more important. But as it becomes more important, it becomes even more critical for you to take an enterprise approach to it. And I think that enterprise approach is very much centered around managing the environment, managing the models, optimizing the models, because, you know, when you deploy analytics, you might get a great answer for 6 months or 3 weeks or whatever, but eventually as you add more data or as data changes or evolves, your models become less significant and aren't as optimized, and so you're going to need the capability to tune what you're doing and manage it over time. And I think that that's almost even more important than, you know, how many algorithms do you have. You know, TIBCO Statistica has something like 15,000 to 16,000 functions in it. So we conquered or checkboxed the math stuff a long time ago. So we have most of the tools you're going to want in a platform like that. The real big question becomes is, are you moving quickly enough where you're going to need a significant level of management and curation of your analytic environment? I think that that's becoming even more important, David, to your point about, you know, how important is it, how many, you know, functions do I have in the platform? I don't know. Howard, what are your thoughts on this?
I have to violently agree with you. And it's worth noting, when you think about algorithm, it's really the codification of the advanced analytics. And you're absolutely right, is that these things have to be governed. They have to be managed. And I think that, you know, you can't be a hobbyist when it comes to this stuff because you're running the business on this stuff. So you have to manage these things, the life cycle, as you mentioned earlier. You have to be able to audit these things too. You have to document them. Everybody has to know what they do and why they do it. And they have to be dynamic. They have to change over time with the business. So I think you're spot on that people have to educate the real value here. There is real value. And it's one of the ingredients to an overall strategy as it relates to things like business intelligence. But, you know, once again, you need to be educated and informed, and you need to have a process in place to do it successfully.
Great. Well, thank you for that. And so with that, we're running low on time. So if people are not familiar with the complete arsenal of software that TIBCO has, you know, we cover all the areas that were addressed in Howard's report. So on the left, we have BI and analytics. So this AI-driven, you know, visualization gives you recommendations on what to look for. If you're not aware, TIBCO did acquire Statistica about 4 months ago. So, you know, it's relatively new to the family, but it's been a product that's been around for 30 years, specializes in data science, so this analytics that can predict the future. And then on the right, you know, we have techniques and tools like Streambase that really help capture and harness streaming analytics and score data in real time. If you're interested in learning more about Statistica, you know, we have a website. If you want to know more about Howard's research, we do have that available on our website, and there's lots of demos and things. So I would encourage everybody to give it a try if you're interested out there. And just, you know, one more mention on Statistica. You know, we really designed this platform over the past 30 years with these three, you know, pillars in mind. And one is to accelerate innovation with data science. So, you know, how can you do these things smart, flexible, and you know, with a comprehensive array of analytics, so you don't have to jump between 15 different tools. You know, we've designed it to scale advanced analytics across the business, so we have reusable templates. The screenshot you see is there's 2 different workflows. The one on the left is a data prep workflow. The one on the right is advanced modeling workflow. Well, the one on the bottom of those purple icons, those whole workflows become parameterized reusable templates. So this helps our organizations stop reinventing the wheel. And then, you know, on the right, you know, we have tools and techniques to infuse algorithms everywhere, so we can export these models to Spotfire for visualizations. You can interact with Spotfire, and it would run the advanced analytic workflows. And again, we could score these things in real time with Streambase as well. So with that, I'd like to thank everybody for their time. I think we've covered a lot of ground. So, you know, thank you to my esteemed guest, Howard Dresner. Thank you so much. And Shawn Rogers, we appreciate your time. Thank you, Ben. Thank you for attending, and thanks for the great questions. So appreciate your time, and have a great day.